So what we did was to observe a number of primary classrooms and find out what was going on. And I imagined this was going to be completely unknown territory. Actually, it turned out to be not very different from what I'd experienced at the age of 5 back in 1947. We have a multi-volume primary curriculum. Quite a substantial research achievement, but the number of teachers who've ever looked at it must be very small indeed. But we also consulted with teachers who were involved at the sharp end, and we managed to identify 13 recurrent curriculum themes, things that come up more or less from the beginning, and gradually as you go in these cycles or spirals or whatever they are through the curriculum, separate out into the subjects typical of senior primary and then of course secondary education. And then we rewrote the first 3 levels of the self-assessment grid. So A1, A2, B1, but for the 5 activities, to make them age-appropriate and domain-specific. That meant we had to create more literacy-oriented descriptors for kids who were capable of literacy development. And we came up with something like that. Again, I can read it from here, but I know it more or less by heart. Those are the global benchmarks for listening and reading, and then we had a second page for spoken interaction, spoken production, and writing. But we knew we were on to a winner here, because when we put the first drafts of these things in front of teachers, they immediately began to talk to one another about the number of kids they got in each of these levels and where the difficulties were, and so on. We went on then to write 13 so-called units of work, so grids again in the form of can-do statements, but oriented to those 13 themes. So there's the one for our school. I'll move on before you expire from the strain of trying to decode it. And then finally, we added scales of underlying linguistic competence simply for grammar, vocabulary, phonology, and orthography, because this was we were trying to create a tool that teachers would be able to use in the classroom, in their preparation, in their observation of kids, and so on. And we felt that this was probably enough dimensions, but we came up with something as simple as that. So for vocabulary control, can recognize, understand, and use a limited range of basic vocabulary which has been used repeatedly in class or has been specifically taught. And then at A2, can recognize, understand, and use a range of vocabulary associated with concrete everyday needs or learning experiences, for example, and so on. And these are very closely derived from the corresponding scales in the framework. Underpinning all of this were these considerations. In an immersion context, clearly learning is going to be driven above all by language use. We wanted to focus the whole time on the development of a communicative repertoire. We also wanted, as I've said already, to focus on metacognitive, metalinguistic awareness, even in very young children. And we wanted to capture the development of these pupils so that it could be easily reported and demonstrated to class teachers, school principal, parents, and school inspectors. Before we came on the scene, the Department of Education and Science inspectors had a system of 3 levels, 1, 2, and 3. They used to go into the schools and say, is he 1, 2, or 3? And 1 was, can't talk English. 1 was, 2 rather, was talks a bit of English. And 3 was talks English. And they actually enshrined that in a circular to all the schools. But then it won't surprise you to know that we decided we would develop a version of the ELP as a key tool for learning and teaching. And we linked it into the benchmarks by having 13 checklists, themed checklists, derived from the 13 units of work or thematic grids. So there are a couple. The three levels, A1, A2, B1, and altogether I think there are just under 200 of these ICANN descriptors in the portfolio, and they represent progressively the repertoire that is implied by these benchmarks. In the passport then we had this reporting page, or two reporting pages. This one is speaking and writing, and we divided up the progression in terms of the amount of support needed to perform tasks with a lot of help, a little help, and no help. And teachers were very inventive in finding ways of gradually filling in the various cells on the grid, so that some of them were able to add new information to this on a weekly or fortnightly basis.